Iniciando ao vivo, calma aí. Deixa o YouTube responder. Estamos ao vivo.
Boa tarde, bem-vindas, bem-vindos. Esse é um evento organizado pela Cátedra da Universidade do Futuro. Eu sou Maria Fernanda Elbert, sou professora do Instituto de Matemática da UFRJ e coordenadora da cátedra. A cátedra reúne pesquisadores de várias áreas do conhecimento, alguns deles estão aqui presentes. Tem o Rodrigo Rosistolato, o Vitor Geraldo, a Ana Célia Castro, e alguns estão no YouTube, e outros, infelizmente, não puderam vir, mas damos todas as boas-vindas a todos que estão aqui. A cátedra trabalha, sobretudo, com dois eixos, principalmente com dois eixos de investigação. Um deles é o impacto dos avanços tecnológicos no mundo do trabalho e nas formas de ensino e produção do conhecimento, e o outro, inovações do sistema de ensino que vem ocorrendo no Brasil e no mundo. O tema da nossa mesa de hoje é propostas inovadoras na educação superior e algumas experiências internacionais. No cartaz de divulgação, ele estava em inglês, vocês devem ter percebido, porque a gente está recebendo duas professoras que trabalham em universidades americanas. A professora Olinto, professora da Universidade de Chicago, e a professora Patricia Summers, que é professora da Universidade do Texas. A gente tem dois canais de transmissão, a gente está contando com a tradução aí do intérprete da Isabela. Bom, a gente também recebe como convidada hoje na mesa, para que vai ajudar a gente, vai acompanhar a gente nessa conversa, a professora Rosana Ehringer, pesquisadora em educação e coordenadora do Laboratório de Estudos e Pesquisas em Educação Superior da Faculdade de Educação da UFRJ. Por diversas razões técnicas, o nosso tempo total vai ser de aproximadamente 1h30, a gente se programou para fazer, mais ou menos com o seguinte roteiro, As duas palestrantes vão fazer suas apresentações, depois eu vou chamar a Rosana Ehringer e o Rodrigo Rosistolato, que são pesquisadores do programa de pós-graduação em educação da UFRJ, para que eles façam as suas intervenções nessa conversa. A gente vai tentar, à medida que o tempo permite, se o tempo permitir, trazer as perguntas do público e dos demais membros da mesa, dentro das possibilidades de tempo. De qualquer forma, eu pediria que as pessoas que estão assistindo no YouTube, que elas se sintam estimuladas a enviarem suas perguntas, porque, mesmo que elas não venham a ser respondidas hoje, elas serão importantes para a nossa reflexão, para a reflexão interna do grupo e também para a programação dos próximos eventos. Então, eu vou começar chamando a professora Patricia Summers, que é professora do Departamento de Administração e Educacional da Universidade do Texas, afiliada ao Centro de Estudos da Mulheres e Gênero e ao Instituto Lausanne de Estudos Latino-Americanos. Então, bem-vinda, professora Patrícia. Eu vou compartilhar aqui a apresentação da professora Patrícia.
I am delighted to be here today com minhas colegas nos Estados Unidos e também no Brasil. I will be mostly speaking in English, and I do have a PowerPoint. I'll be talking about the future of higher education and what is called the SHE session, the impact of the pandemic and the economy on women. Próximo. Por favor. It's been said that the pandemic is something called a black swan event. It's interesting. In Europe, in the 1700s, they sat around and had debates about things like, are there black swans? Because there were only white swans in Europe. Obviously, a very, very important question. So they made this conclusion that therefore only swans were white. And in Britain in particular, swans are very revered. So because they'd only seen white swans, those were the only ones that existed. Ironically, they discovered Australia and it became a colony, and they found out that there were black swans. So there was a huge paradigm shift because the assumptions had changed. I want to point out to the Brazilian audience that when I talk about higher education, I mean after grade 12.
Recording in progress.
It's what's called the postgraduação. Okay, so there was this disruptive event that changed things, that really forced a paradigm shift. And some are saying that the same thing is happening now with the COVID pandemic, Proximo. Okay, so there's 7 futures of higher education. I'm going to run through these relatively quickly because I think really the interesting part is in the she session, and how, particularly in the United States, we can change things so easily. The first future, and these are from Bryant Alexander from Georgetown University, by the way, the peak higher education. And in this scenario, at least in the United States, enrollment, students, institutions, faculty peaked in 2012, and they've gone downhill ever since. Since then, there are fewer students, institutions, full-time faculty. Then the second future is healthcare nation. I went to my doctor's office yesterday, and they were booming. It's the place to be in Texas. It is the largest sector of the economy in the United States as of 2018. Medical services are dominant, and it's also organized geographically. So there are medical parks. For example, when I went to my doctor, in the same area, there was a little village that had all the related services, and that's called the medical geography, Proximo. Then open education. I just got an email earlier today about having more open educational resources that are low or no cost, particularly open access to scholarship and data sets, which is wonderful, open source software. It's mostly online, it's low cost, it's accessible, but it's not always accurate. It needs to be vetted very carefully. The fourth future is Renaissance. There are many trends, but we probably can't see the Renaissance trends until later, after several generations. Proximo. The augmented campus, and it's really divided by digital strategy. It's mostly online. There are commuter classes only in person. It's low cost, again, and accessible. So you see that in some of these futures, the cost and the accessibility are the most important variables. The sixth is called Siri Tutor Me, and they're based on advances in artificial intelligence, new resources, and tutoring. And ironically, Brian Alexander, who put this together, joked that, when Alexandra Ocasio will be president, we will eventually move on to this. Proximo. Okay, and finally, the Retrop Campus. It recaptures the height of the 1990s. There is resistance to digital technology. The campus is set apart because you have to check all of your digitals when you enter campus. There are more buildings. I didn't think we needed any more buildings. There are fewer digitals in class, and tend to use the pedagogies of the past. So those are the 7 futures that are possible. And there are variations on these that I see every day. Proximo. Okay, so I want to talk about the she session. And it's from an article that I wrote with Zach Taylor and Corey Benson, and this is me actually a very long time ago. If the picture were larger, you would see that the sign above my head actually says women working. But in fact, women have lost ground in the struggle for gender equity in the United States. The US is 32nd place in the world based on economic opportunities. Women's employment rose almost steadily up until 2000, but now It's no longer at that level. It's back to 1966. Women make up 60%, made 60% of what men earned in the 70s. Now they only make 83%. They haven't advanced that much. There are strong norms that eschew anything but full-time paid work for husbands, but not for spouses. Women are affected by other lingering types of institutional sexism. I won't go into all of those, but that's the case, and we talk about them in that article. Combined with cultural norms about what should be and is women's work and their role in the family, women's employment has stalled and declined. And in the United States, at least, we are falling farther behind rather than making gains. Proximo. Next slide. Yeah. Yes. The She session. And this is where I'm going to be talking about some of the research that has been done, particularly in Scandinavian and Nordic countries, but also other countries as well. And this is all post-pandemic. So some of it has just been released provisionally. And I have provided the URL chains for you to go to these articles that I mentioned. There were overnight drastic changes in people's lives because there were 1.2 billion students around the world who were in schools that had closed. They had parents, even if they had two parents living or in the same house, they still had to divide up how the child care was addressed. In Iceland, which is the most equal country in the world, what they found is that essentially these women were kicked back to their 1950s roles. And they found that time is gendered. Women do 2 times as much childcare and household work during the pandemic. And ironically, companies lauded this as the model for remote work. And if it's a model, it's a poor model because it puts so much stress on the women. So the family work, as they call it, fell to women, including the housework, the childcare, and the mental labor. Plus, they had the addition of the emotional labor, which was all the guilt that they felt because they couldn't do everything as they had before. One woman said, I turned into a foreman. I could not show any weakness. I had to run my whole house and family and carry the entire burden. And another woman pointed out that if she got through the day and she did only the necessary activities, like the kids were running around in pajamas all day and they didn't have any schooling, they didn't get baths. And in the Iceland study, it's really interesting because the authors are identified as being so-and-so's daughter, like Hajam daughter. And both of them are women, and so they have the daughter in their names. That's what it stands for. Next slide, please. Okay, the PET study in the US, which is published in 2021, they talked about the gendered nature of expectations for women, the lack of access to childcare and participation in homeschooling, the increased risk of unemployment in mothers. The reopening of schools were really vital to reducing gender inequities, but a lot of schools held off on that first fall or first September in the United States when our school year starts. They just didn't know what decision to make, so they kept the schools closed. We're trying to, along with 2 of my colleagues, Kelly Susi and Zach Taylor, were looking at how to develop a COVID school calendar for even different parts of the country in the United States and different countries in the world that would reduce the times when the time of school calendars during the highest COVID peaks. And we have enough information now, at least at the University of Texas, because we've been monitoring this, that we can predict when those times are. Next slide. Okay, so how can we build a female future of childcare work? Is it the key to America's recovery from the 2020 recession? And this was a study that was done by DeFrancesco Soto and others in the LBA School of Public Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. Next slide. So what this does is it recognizes that there are possibilities for childcare workers to become part of this system, part of the economy, not just, I pick up a few hours at the daycare center, but they can do programs for many children at the same time and really transform the economy. Next slide. Okay, so DeFrancesco Soto identified three main issues. The first is the failure to listen, the failure to identify women's economic security needs. We need to listen to women talk of their economic security and their needs. All mothers need childcare. The issue really cuts across income and generations, so that it affects everyone. And it affects men too, because it takes stress off the family if you have proper access to childcare. And jobs and equal pay are actually the biggest concerns of women across the board. Next slide. Okay, inadequate care and pay. So childcare workers are underpaid and inadequately trained. So that includes things like the childcare system fails everyone. Childcare availability has not kept up with labor market growth, which has been a key factor in the United States and in other countries. The childcare crisis really hurts our American economy and hurts all economies. We need to establish and invest in high quality childcare as a key element of any economy. And we need to compensate childcare workers fairly. And there needs to be an assumption that the entire economy relies on childcare workers. They shouldn't be untrained. They shouldn't be lowest on the pay scale. They shouldn't be assigned a second-class citizenship. Next slide. And then the third is fighting automation. So there are a lot of women's work out there that will be automated out of existence in the short term, but you can't really automate childcare. Although there is a commercial in the United States that shows robots trying to take care of your children. They don't do a very good job. So the majority of childcare workers are female. This protects women's work. You can't outsource it to a robot. It acknowledges women's dual roles as caretakers and participants. And it's similar to STEM pathways, which we've developed in the United States, which are mostly for male employees who are in dead-end, low-paying jobs, to give them a pathway. This gives a similar kind of pathway to women who have been low-paid and who have lower skill levels because they just haven't been trained. Childcare cannot be automated. It's permanent and it's stable work. Childcare provides economic growth for women, men, families, the workforce, and the economy. So overall, everyone benefits if there is quality childcare. Next slide. Okay, these are the list of the references, and you should be able to pick these up. Now, remember, some of them haven't been formally published yet. They're called preprints. There is one in here that I talk about that is with Susie and Taylor. We're trying to do the COVID calendar and how regions and countries can predict when the lowest exposure rates are, and then set up their academic calendars around that. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for being so attentive.
Muito obrigada, Patrícia. Agradeço bastante pela sua excelente apresentação. A gente vai dar continuidade, a gente vai chamar agora a professora Ângela Olinto. Depois a gente volta a palavra, né? Eu vou convidar a professora Ângela Olinto, que é astrofísica, professora da Universidade de Chicago. Em 2018, ela se tornou a primeira mulher a ocupar o cargo de decana da Divisão de Ciências, Físicas e Matemáticas da Universidade de Chicago. É membro da Academia Nacional de Ciências dos Estados Unidos e membro correspondente da Academia Brasileira de Ciências. Professora Ângela, a palavra é sua. Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Maria Fernanda e todos pelo convite. Eu vou falar em inglês porque fica mais fácil, porque aí Pat and I can dialogue in English. So sorry for the translators that we jump around, but have a wonderful evening, everybody. I hope, that was quite an interesting presentation, and I didn't prepare slides because I'm not actually, I don't study higher education, I live it. So I'm going to give you a summary of my own perspective, which is, very much what I have lived, as opposed to having studied what is happening in higher education as a general, topic of study. I'm an astrophysicist. So for those who don't know me, I grew up in Brazil. My family's Brazilian. I went to undergraduate in Brazil, in PUC, Rio. And then after I did my undergraduate degree, my bachelor degree, I went to the US and joined MIT to do physics as a PhD student, and finished my PhD in physics, particle physics, and then became an astrophysics, particle physics person. And today we call ourselves astroparticle physicists. And that's my field of study. Recently, in the last 4 years, I have been what we call Dean of the Physical Mathematical Sciences, or the Physical Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. With that experience is what I'll try to talk a little bit to all of you. So this is, a perspective from what in the US we call the R1 university, or the top tier research university. So I think just to give a sense of the field, I think we need to remember that in Brazil and in the US, there are different ways of organizing higher education. The US is known as being one of the strongest. It has an enviable tradition in higher education with the R1 universities, the famous names like MIT, Harvard, Chicago, Yale, etc., Stanford. Those are UT Austin. Thank you, Pat, for being here. These are universities which are, designed around research as one of their main themes. So it's teaching, and in our case, and I think most cases, MIT is a little bit different than Chicago. So I'm going to give you the University of Chicago version. We are a liberal arts education principle for the college. So the undergraduates in the college, which in Brazil is the bachelor's, the candidates for the bachelor's degree, those are studying the liberal arts, which means natural sciences, including biological and physical and mathematical sciences, social sciences, humanities, and different flavors of how different topics align. So, sometimes the arts are in the humanities, history and philosophy can be in one or the other. But anyway, those are all the sort of liberal arts education. And in Chicago, we're very proud to try to preserve that people really should have as broad an education as they can before they become professionally conscious. So read all the great books as an undergraduate, and then really focus on something that might get you a job. And so in talking about innovation, one of the things we're trying to develop is an easy way for our liberal arts undergraduates to get, quickly into a master's program once they finish, so they can get jobs that can pay for their undergraduate education. Because one of the US traditions too, which is different from Europe, for example, is that we tend to have our students incur a lot of debt. So it's very expensive to go to these R1 universities, and eventually they have to pay that back. So eventually one needs to go from the liberal arts to the professional side. And we're trying to innovate in that area to find it easy for folks to have the first part of their lives when they're forming their views of the world, to have that liberal education background. And that helps, I hope, learning how to think as opposed to what to think. And then when we go to the master's or PhD, but in the case of professional types, we try to bridge that and give folks an easy connecting and moving over. And when the professional side becomes part of education in say a master's degree or a PhD, which is more of a research track, as opposed to academic research versus the professional, let's go to work, you have to also do a lot more, and this is one of my worries as a dean, a lot more of career services, a lot more of engagement of where the students are going to be employed once they finish that 1 year of professional training or 2 years or more. Okay, so that's some of the things that, just to give a sense of where I come from and what my worries are, given where I am, which is in an R1 university. So first, I just wanted to say that I have great admiration by an actual passion for this idea of a liberal arts education, and I hope that we can preserve it, even if the financial stresses are forcing folks to professionalize a bit early so that they can get paying jobs. But it is important to remember that it's the more the more humans that can do a liberal arts, the easier it is to have, serious debates and critical thinking. And these days that we live in social media, understanding what part of the social media is reasonably, curated and which parts might be complete garbage. Forgive my nomenclature here. Is important to have that critical thinking, to understand what is it that you're being fed. Right, so I think that's something that I value quite a bit, and I hope we can survive in the liberal arts education tradition. Although the financial burden of it is something very serious. So from where I am, which is in the physical and mathematical sciences, we have quite a reasonable market, let's put it that way, for folks getting jobs, right? So it is very hard to imagine these days having difficulty with the job, at least in the US, if your degree is in mathematical sciences, for example, computer science, statistics, or data science. I think that is a big need of the current economy. But I find it very important for everybody who's not in my, mathematical sciences box to learn about what is it that, what's behind the Zoom that we're using, what's behind Facebook, what's behind the social media, what's behind social networks, how these things get optimized. And, you probably do wonder how, these machines know what you might want to buy and how come that you clicked on something you did not want to buy, and now you get a lot of that over and over again. So how are we living in that world, and having a critical knowledge of that world, I think, is important for all areas. And there is negatives, which is being manipulated by these platforms, but there are also positives, which is digital humanities, for example. I think there are many things in the digital world that can actually be interesting for the arts, interesting for the humanities, interesting for history. There are many new ways of trying to use data science, for example, in the great books, in even looking at cuneiform and other ancient writings, how to translate texts there are things that computers can do quite well in that space too, and I think one should be very open-minded about that. All right, so that's one topic, which is living in the digital world. One other, which connects somewhat to another topic I wanted to mention, which is that this enviable tradition in the US is being not as reputable as it used to be. So if you ask, there's a new poll that just came out of New America, and that poll shows a huge decline during the pandemic from 2020 to 2022. The number of Americans that thought that higher education was a positive contribution to the country used to be in the 70% role and is now in the 55%. So there was quite a decline over these past 2 years. So during the pandemic, folks did not, seem to remind ourselves as a country in the US of the value of that tradition. But the other number that to me is pretty scary is that of that poll, those who thought higher education was important, 75% Democrats, 37% of the Republicans, those voting Republicans. So that polarization in our society today is another major problem, right? If we only have one of the two parties in the US going to college, this gap is going to just get higher and higher and higher. And so I think this is something that's, everywhere, not just in higher education. How do we bridge this gap? How do we make the gap be smaller as opposed to wider and wider and wider? How do we bring those of different opinions into the fold and have that conversation and have hopefully an educated conversation about differences and different perspectives? And this is, I think, one of the major challenges that we live today. For me personally, I think Pat already mentioned quite a bit about how difficult it is to be a woman. And, in the physical sciences, physical-mathematical sciences, you can exponentiate that problem. We are very, very few. I am an optimist, and because when I entered MIT, there were 2 women and 60 guys in the class, and it was a little awkward, to put it mildly. And it was very hard all the way to now, but I saw the change. I saw 20% coming in today versus the 3% that was coming in the mid-80s. So I think we have made a lot of progress. We have women in leadership roles like the dean at the University of Chicago, but one lady's running the National Science Foundation. The Academy of Sciences has a lot more women than it used to be, and minorities too, and underrepresented minorities in the US, for example, African Americans, natives. But it's still a tiny. I think women have really improved in numbers, but the other categories are really, really small. So we have a ridiculous bias against a more diverse set of minds thinking the physical and mathematical sciences. And that's one of my main concerns as I try to, locally do something about this. So it's, I think, a constant effort, and the She Session, which is a new term for me, thank you, Pat, is not helping at all. So it was hard before the pandemic, now it's even harder. So we really need to be very coherent and try very hard to bridge that gap. So to me, diversity, inclusion, and what I like to call belonging to, which is a term that has been used starting with the folks at UC Berkeley, as a theme to really engage, first generation students, minorities of all types of, all the different identity classes. So I think, we need to do a lot of work there. It's a tiny better than it used to be, but really a lot of work to get to some place that would make sense and would be better for society as a whole and the planet. All right, so I also thought I'll share some innovative ideas that I happen to be working on, and these are more local, even more local than what I mentioned before, which are worries about everything. So as I mentioned, one of the things that I think is really important is that I think the digital world, the data science, computer science, math, statistics, these need to be taught widely. People really need to understand what is driving the whole social media revolution, and how these things connect, and how to trust some things and not trust other things, and how do you sort of survive in that world. and how to take apart a cell phone. How does that work? So I think one of the main concerns I have is the fear of math, and how that needs to go. We need to get rid of the fear of math. Who's afraid of beautiful math, right? I mean, can we get, who would be afraid of chocolate, right? So how can we make math and chocolate be similar so that we have not, this tendency right from the start that math is difficult. And, the math can be difficult and literature can be difficult, but math can be quite easy too. And I think the stereotypes associated with the fear of math is a real challenge. And that's something that I think we can do something about. I just finished reading a wonderful book that I highly recommend to everybody. It's an old one. It's called Whistling Vivaldi. And it's about the stereotype threat and how that affects different folks, and especially women with math is a major problem. And so I'll share the notes later. But let me continue a little bit more. That the stereotype threat is one big barrier for many more diverse populations to join colleges. We have the funding. I mentioned that before, how major debt is an issue for certainly in the US. The idea of having online courses is something that in principle can make things cheaper in the sense of access, so people don't have to live on campus and they can maybe work and do some of the online studies on the side. But for undergraduate, my belief is that you need to socialize. It's not just the faculty talking on the screen. It is about meeting your peers, discussing things. It's the homework, it's the discussions on the weekends, and those experiences are three-dimensional. And I think for faculty also, it's a lot harder to have engagement in two dimensions. So I think we can do a mixture of both of those things, but we can't just rely on the online solving the problem. So we really need to think seriously about how to maintain sustainability financially of the whole system. And on the engagement with others, for our point of view, which is the research university types, so the R1s, I think community colleges in the US are a wonderful resource. That's a much wider network and much more accessible financially. So we at the University of Chicago have been developing in our fields of the physical mathematical sciences, in particular with Data Science Institute, which we're just building now, partnerships with community colleges and ways of engaging community colleges students and teaching staff and faculty back and forth, and doing exchanges of postdoctoral fellows and lots of interesting new ideas there to be able to really share knowledge across different parts of higher education. What else do I want to say? Yes, the partnerships with industry, I think, is another major thing. I think we tend to want to be, at least in my field, I have a Webb Space Telescope picture behind me, and I can't imagine astrophysicists in industry. However, most of our students, most of our graduate students that get their PhDs are not becoming faculty members. They end up in the industry, not necessarily using, they might be related to the aerospace and the space science side of our industry, but mostly in data science or even financial mathematics and other types of engagement in industry that can be done with PhDs in the physical sciences. So how do we engage the industry and partner with them as early as possible and ease that transition? So I think I mentioned already the bachelor plus master's idea, how to make the bachelor master combination give a sense of, yes, you can think about liberal arts and then move on to the industry partnership. And those industries we really want to engage, well, in our case, that we are at the University of Chicago, would be the Chicagoland area, and engaging with the students being placed in the different industry as training, and vice versa. They learn from the industry and the industry learns from our students, especially on, for example, data science spaces. And how, this partnership with industry is something that traditional research-based universities have, been challenged with, because Many of the faculty believe that, what we do is pure fundamental research and it should not be something translation or applied. I think that thinking has changed quite a bit. I do believe that, at least in our faculty, it's much more common to have the wish to translate, the wish to apply, the wish to connect, and if possible, to do both fundamental research and a translational bit. So how do these things get balanced is another good challenge for us to be thinking about. And I think, let me see, I think I'll just close by saying that I really hope that, I don't know of the futures that Pat mentioned, that the Renaissance one sounded good. I'm not sure what exactly it entails, but really valuing the fundamentals that we came from on the higher education, on the liberal arts values, and thinking them in a more, obviously, new millennium. We need to be a little more agile and adaptive and flexible, but really the learning how to think, including the novelties of where we are in society today, I think is really important. And I hope we find many creative ways to keep that energy and that excitement and, and the students engaged. I think I'll stop here, Maria, if that's okay. Maria Fernanda. I should say that Claude Steele wrote...
Muito obrigada, Ângela, pelas suas contribuições. Como eu tinha falado no começo, eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Rosana Ehringer, que é coordenadora do Laboratório de Estudos e Pesquisas em Educação Superior da Faculdade de Educação da FRJ. Bem-vinda, Rosana. Obrigada pela sua presença, pela sua participação. Com você a palavra.
Boa tarde. Agradeço o convite para estar aqui com vocês hoje. Eu estou feliz de rever a Patricia, né? Nós estivemos brevemente juntas lá na Universidade do Texas há 2 anos atrás e fico muito feliz dela ter aceito o convite para estar dialogando com a gente. É um prazer conhecer a professora Ângela. O nosso comentário vai ser breve, né? Até para a gente ter tempo para ouvi-las mais também, mas eu queria trazer 2 pontos. Em primeiro lugar, a gente tem, a minha percepção é de que nós ainda não conseguimos absorver totalmente todos os impactos que os efeitos da pandemia na educação e na educação superior em particular trouxeram para as nossas práticas e para a nossa vivência no ensino superior, né? Mesmo guardadas todas as diferenças entre o sistema de educação superior dos Estados Unidos, o brasileiro, mas como a Patrícia falou, né, todo o globo, todo o mundo foi atingido por essas mudanças bruscas, né, por esse cisne negro, né? Então, eu gostaria de ouvi-las um pouco mais sobre como vocês consideram, a partir até mesmo da experiência de vocês como docentes, né, e das estratégias que cada universidade enfrentou, os seus respectivos departamentos, para lidar com a questão do ensino remoto, né, após com a pandemia, mas principalmente com o retorno, né, porque nós temos tido alguns debates aqui no Brasil sobre as dificuldades que tem sido essa volta também, né, essa volta ao presencial, né, e será que voltamos, né, ao que era antes, né, ou será que, de fato, temos efeitos aí que são irreversíveis, né? Então, quando Patrícia trouxe a questão da educação aberta, né, da educação acessível, né, e justamente do peso do digital, né? Mas aí, ao mesmo tempo, a Ângela traz, não, mas a gente não pode esquecer que faz diferença, né, principalmente para os primeiros anos da formação, essa presença, esse engajamento, essa troca, né? Então, quais têm sido essas lições, vamos dizer assim, né, desse período que nós vivemos no ensino remoto e, principalmente, as estratégias hoje para lidarmos com esse momento, né, após a pandemia, né, que ainda não terminou totalmente, mas já estamos novamente no presencial, né? E, assim, só para ilustrar, Aqui nós já tivemos a oportunidade de estar em alguns debates, e temos trabalhado sobre isso, discutindo, por exemplo, que em universidades de pesquisa, né, o fato de nós, na pandemia, a gente ter se inovado em termos de ensino remoto, buscar formas de atrair os alunos, de mantê-los aqui interessados, engajados e atentos, né, fez com que o ensino tivesse uma centralidade maior para as nossas atividades, né? Muitas vezes os professores, como a Ângela mencionou, né, estão muito envolvidos com as atividades de pesquisa, principalmente em determinados perfis de universidade, e a gente não talvez desse toda a atenção ao ensino, né? Então, isso seria um efeito, né? Seria esse olhar inclusive para as demandas que os estudantes trazem, né? Esse olhar para a questão de quais são as estratégias, como eu disse, para a gente estar mais próximo dos estudantes e das suas demandas, né? E um outro ponto que eu queria colocar é justamente em relação ao tema principal que a Patrícia trouxe, né, que foi a questão de gênero e das desigualdades persistentes, né, na educação superior. E a Ângela trouxe também a questão enfim, da nossa divisão, da nossa desigualdade de gênero na questão das carreiras, né? Então, me parece que esse é um tema que, de novo, né, foi amplificado pela pandemia, né, junto com várias outras demandas, várias outras necessidades, e eu acredito que a gente precisa pensar também estratégias justamente para romper com esses estereótipos associados às carreiras do cuidado, como carreiras tradicionalmente femininas, né, e as carreiras de STEM, né, e de outras áreas, como carreiras que ainda se mantêm tipicamente masculinas. E aí eu gostaria de saber também de iniciativas que vocês tenham em relação justamente a transição, né, do ensino médio para o ensino superior, que é algo que a gente tem também trabalhado, pensado bastante, né? Ângela falou das parcerias com os community colleges, né? Mas eu imagino que isso até teria que vir num passo anterior, né? Ainda nas escolas de ensino médio. Então, seria interessante se vocês pudessem compartilhar algo sobre essa atuação, né, das universidades em que vocês atuam, nessa transição também, naquele momento de escolhas de carreiras, né, e de busca por um caminho ainda no ensino médio. Tá? Bom, eu teria várias outras questões, mas acho que o nosso tempo é curto, acho que é melhor, então, a gente ouvir os colegas e agradecer muito a vocês pela disponibilidade de conversarem com a gente.
Bom, se a Ângela e a Pet não se incomodarem, eu acho que eu passaria a palavra para o Rodrigo, antes de voltar a palavra para vocês, pode ser assim? Que aí, bom, o Rodrigo é membro da cátedra, né, colega da cátedra, e é também do programa de pós-graduação em educação, do UFRJ. Então, não sei se vocês preferem falar primeiro ou se a gente deixa a intervenção do Rodrigo e depois a gente volta para vocês.
Rodrigo, por favor.
Bom, boa noite já, né, para todos aqui novamente, para aqueles que estão nos assistindo no YouTube. Eu gostaria, antes de mais nada, de agradecer pelas excelentes apresentações feitas pela Patrícia e pela Ângela. Trouxeram questões que são realmente muito interessantes e que têm total relação com muito do que nós temos discutido aqui no âmbito da cátedra. Essa cátedra ela foi pensada, foi construída com o objetivo principal de pensar novas iniciativas de formação no ensino superior, articuladas a uma série de questões, inclusive ao próprio mercado de trabalho e as novas expectativas com relação a profissionais de nível superior. E daí, o nome da própria cátedra, né, Universidade do Futuro, ele é um nome bastante, digamos, ambicioso, porque revela um pouco da nossa expectativa, que é muito de entender o que tem acontecido em termos de inovação no ensino superior, no Brasil e no mundo, para que possamos, a partir daí, sistematizar um conjunto de conhecimentos sobre esses processos e pensar também a própria UFRJ. Podemos pensar aqui a Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, a partir daquilo que tem acontecido no Brasil e no mundo. Daí, considerando as apresentações de vocês, foram muito interessantes. Eu penso que, começando pela Patrícia, a Patrícia traz algumas questões centrais sobre, a Rosana pontuou isso também, né? Traz algumas questões centrais sobre a permanência das dinâmicas de gênero e das desigualdades relacionadas a gênero. Com relação ao cuidado das crianças, né, a Patrícia traz essa informação de que a pandemia ampliou significativamente as preocupações femininas com as crianças. É algo curioso, porque é uma espécie de um retorno a um período anterior, né, onde essas preocupações eram estavam exclusivamente na pauta das mulheres, as preocupações com as crianças, e, de repente, a pandemia trouxe isso de volta. E aí, olhando para esse cenário, né, ela também traz essa questão da abertura do ensino superior para outras formas de acesso, incluindo o ensino superior online. Então, fico pensando, não sei se Patrícia tem já alguma reflexão mais consolidada sobre isso, se as formas, né, não presenciais de ensino superior, considerando formas híbridas e formas totalmente virtualizadas, né, totalmente no mundo online, teriam aí um impacto positivo ou negativo para as mulheres, especificamente, para as meninas e para as mulheres que estão iniciando aí o ensino superior. Porque, e a outra, né, diretamente associada a essa primeira questão, é sobre a ideia de equalização de gênero. A Patrícia traz uns dados muito importantes para nós pensarmos sobre isso, porque a pandemia, pelo que ela está apontando, e tem vários outros estudos aqui no Brasil também indicando isso, ampliou as desigualdades de gênero sob o ponto de vista do acesso, da permanência no ensino superior. Agora, no pós-pandemia, né, o que a gente pode pensar a partir daí? Né? Nós voltaríamos a uma tendência progressiva de tentativa de equalização de gênero sob o ponto de vista do acesso, porque, ao mesmo tempo, as pesquisas têm indicado que, na educação básica, por exemplo, que é o meu foco de pesquisa principalmente, as meninas têm superado os meninos em desempenho, em todas as disciplinas, né? Inclusive, a matemática, né? A Ângela falou um pouco sobre isso, a matemática que era o diferencial dos meninos, os meninos têm perdido, né, esse diferencial. Os meninos estão se aproximando cada vez mais dos meninos e superando, inclusive, em desempenho matemático, o que é muito bom. Ao mesmo tempo, no ensino superior, temos aí a manutenção de algumas desigualdades e que foram, inclusive, ampliadas pela própria pandemia. Daí, pensando no futuro da universidade, queria perguntar diretamente para a Patrícia, né, se nas pesquisas que ela tem realizado, ela tem encontrado mais iniciativas das universidades no sentido da redução das desigualdades de gênero, se há alguma iniciativa nesse sentido, ou se esse cenário de uma consolidação de cursos que são majoritariamente masculinos e outros cursos que são majoritariamente femininos permanece ainda naturalizada, né? Isso conecta um pouco já com o que a Ângela trouxe sobre essa questão também das mulheres nas ciências, né? Então, a minha pergunta também vai para a Ângela, considerando especificamente a Universidade de Chicago. Ela trouxe algumas informações sobre isso, queria saber um pouquinho mais sobre essas iniciativas para a atração das meninas para as áreas científicas, né? Como é que isso tem se dado. E da Ângela, falando mais especificamente, né, eu achei muito interessante, logo no início da sua fala, quando você traz essa reflexão sobre a articulação entre as humanidades e a formação de cientistas das áreas ditas duras, né? Realmente, essa é uma outra questão que é muito cara para todos nós aqui da Cátedra Universidade do Futuro, é algo que a gente tem pensado muito sobre essas possíveis articulações, né, entre as disciplinas das grandes áreas, né, humanidades, ciências exatas e etc., articulações possíveis entre essas disciplinas e articulações também entre áreas, entre grandes áreas de conhecimento. Quando você traz essa reflexão sobre a importância das humanidades na formação dos profissionais das ciências e de todas as outras áreas, eu achei bastante interessante o que a reflexão que você pontuou. E eu queria ouvir um pouquinho mais sobre a trajetória típica de um estudante de graduação na Universidade de Chicago. Como é que ela acontece, né? E aí, pensando, do seu ponto de vista das trajetórias formativas, como é que se dá essa articulação? Você pontuou isso, você tem aí um modelo de formação que conduz também ao mestrado, logo na sequência, mas queria entender um pouco melhor, acho isso muito importante para o que a gente tem pensado aqui, né? Como é que se dá a trajetória típica de um estudante que entra na Universidade de Chicago, né, e progressivamente escolhe a sua carreira. Então, são essas as minhas questões, e, para além disso... sim, outro ponto para a Ângela, sobre essa questão do lugar das humanidades nesse novo mundo, né, nesse mundo que está cada vez mais digital. As humanidades, há algumas visões que olham para as humanidades e as pensam como algo que seria um tanto quanto antagônico ao mundo digital. Há outras abordagens que dizem o contrário, que as humanidades também virão a se digitalizar progressivamente. Então, queria saber um pouco mais, te ouvir um pouco mais sobre isso. No mais, só agradecer pelas excelentes apresentações.
Muitas perguntas, né? Muitas coisas para a gente refletir. Eu acho que eu passo primeiro a palavra para a Paty, se você puder, e depois a gente passa para a Ângela, pode ser?
Perfect. And just to be clear, we turn on our video when we're talking, correct?
Sim, claro.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is that Angela knows a lot about higher education, because all of the things she talked about have shown up in the research. Actually, some of it back to the 1920s, about universities and students persisting in universities versus dropping out, the role of universities. So actually our presentations are complementary of each other. And I find that very interesting.
That's why I wanted you to go first, so I could follow up and not repeat anything you said. But thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I don't know, Maria, that's why I was wondering if you want both of us on, or I'll turn it off and I'll wait.
I think that the statistics really speak for themselves. And I think the United States is probably not alone in having problems with particularly automation, putting lower income people out of work, and people of color in particular in at-risk communities. And Angela talked about diversity and how important that is, and how in this whole process we need to uplift those who are the poorest among us, need to make sure that they have opportunities, because we're only as good as those who are the most at risk in society. Are there any specific questions you want me to address?
Maybe I'm wondering, because Rosanna and Rodrigo had some questions for you and for me. I don't know if you got them translated to you. Did you get them?
No, I didn't.
Oh, all right. So maybe I can give it some help here, because I try to just take notes of the ones directed to me, but let's talk. I think what Rodrigo, you can help me a little, but I think what he was interested is understanding more from your studies, on the impact of especially girls, and he studies girls and boys and how girls were outdoing boys in math included in schools pre-pandemic, and the pandemic might shift that or not. So you already talked about the women, but is this a long-term effect? Have we had the impact on a younger population also? And I think I wrote a lot about what I should be replying to him. The other question, that Rosanna brought earlier that you might want to address, and then I'll do my questions afterwards, are, the long-term impact of the pandemic on the negative and the positive side, possibly. Is there going to be a new normal, or are we going to be in this hybrid situation for the long run? I guess predicting the future is always harder than the past, but I think, we did learn a lot. And one of the things she pointed out is that a lot of us that are driven by research had to spend a lot more time preparing to give lectures in 2 dimensions on the screen. So we actually paid more attention to teaching, which could be a positive thing, especially if we got organized enough that, we have nice slides that work well and so forth. So of the positives, right, I think there's always a distribution, but of those who we're able to engage with the new platform and do a good job teaching, that can have positive effects in the long run. But anyway, you can address these issues, but and how this shock of the pandemic, of the SHE session, how is that affecting the younger generations? Can we get over this in the next round, and things like that?
I think it's a long-term project. We have a whole, even though it's just a couple of years, we have a whole generation of students, particularly elementary school and middle school, and many in early high school, who don't know anything else than online instruction. And I think that they don't have a strong interaction skills. They've missed out cognitively. There's something called the summer drift, where if you take time off in the summer, well, most students do, most schedules have a summer vacation. If you take off an extended period of time, then you begin to forget material, and you have to go back and retake it. I think in general, we're probably having a more timid group of students, of young people coming through the system. They may delay more going on to college. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, Rodrigo, is that I think particularly for younger women, pre-college women who have been doing so well in math and science, we should be encouraging them to go the STEM route that has already been identified for mostly male populations. But certainly the women could easily move into that if they are encouraged to do so.
Do you know, Pat, I'm going to interrupt because Rodrigo asked that. Do you know some, projects and or ways of engaging the women in STEM that you think have worked well? Do you have any examples in the practice?
Oh, yes, we have at the University of Texas, we have a number of programs that identify women as early as high school, as early as middle school, who are interested in the sciences. There's the Duke TIP program, among others, that seeks out bright students and mentors them from junior high school, essentially. And at UT, we have a number of programs starting in middle school and high school, where at the beginning, young women can come to campus and talk with women scientists and engineers and computer programmers. They can take part in things called a lockdown. Dell Computer does a weekend lockdown where they give you a problem on Friday afternoon. They give you lots of pizza. And then by Sunday afternoon, your group presents the results from tackling that particular problem. So there are lots of possibilities there. They also have, I think, successfully used those women as they go through the system. They may not even be in college yet, but they're going back to their high schools and they're talking to other young women about there are possibilities. We are sending out women students to interact with the high schools and with the middle schools and with the parents too. The parents are really important. So that's a possibility. So I think there's lots of promise there, particularly on the STEM side for women. And I think we need to take advantage of that.
Yeah, just to add, at Chicago, we have many of these programs too. One that we're very engaged is called Space Explorers. And those are high school students who basically spend an immersion over the year. We have once a week and then a little bigger get together. They are from the high schools around the university. Many of our universities in the US have not such wealthy populations around us. So, it's mostly African-American and low income and, public schools. And they all go to college. They don't necessarily end up in astrophysics, which is too bad, but but they end up going to college and getting jobs and mostly in STEM, many in engineering and medicine. So, I think for a first generation, so many things are helpful to folks that have the curiosity to drive, but they haven't no family members that have done that before. So having the support. So I think, we, the scientists, like to talk about the beautiful images of the sky and the reasons that these areas are so exciting, but we need those on the ground helping. How does one become myself, right? How does one get there if you don't have anybody in your family who's ever been to college? And I think that transition and mentoring is an investment that one needs to do. So it's nice to visit high schools and give talks, but we need real staff, folks that give infrastructure, that that not only the excitement gets transmitted, but also the knowledge on how to maneuver your way to college, say in the US, but I imagine in Brazil too. What types of expectations and what are the challenges and financial help. We have a lot of financial aid at the University of Chicago. It's a very expensive university, but we have a very large number of students that can't afford us that are there because there's financial aid. So if you can afford, you pay. If you can't, you don't. But getting in is very, very expensive, right? But I think so it's getting better, the trends in STEM in general, but computer science, which is key for this digital world we live in, is still a major challenge. And that to me is the girls that code is something I think is astronomy is attractive without too much effort, but coding is still very male culture, and it's a younger, different male culture than the physicists that I met when I was a young kid. And that breaking that barrier is super important because, as you know, we are we're right now on a digital platform. Okay, but that was one of the questions. Maria Fernanda, you want to?
And I was going to add as well that we've been very successful in using clergy, reaching out to whole communities, the pastors, the priests, because they have a sense of how important education is. And they can go out to the schools and they can interact with their communities and get the message through to low-income families, to women, and so forth. And I'll also give you a tip in that Dell has a very large, Dell Brazil has a very large presence at the, what do they call it? The Enterprise Institute at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul. And every time I go there, I go to the lunchroom and they say, Round Rock. And they want to talk about Round Rock. So that's another unused resource there.
Excellent. Maria, Fernanda, you joined. I don't know if you want to keep maneuvering here. Otherwise, I'll follow some of the questions that Rodrigo and Rosanna sent. Shall we? How are we doing? Okay, so another question is about...
Acho que você pode continuar, Angela. Deixa eu só aproveitar essa interrupçãozinha, só para trazer uma pergunta que foi coletada no YouTube. Aí são muitas perguntas, né? Tem as perguntas do Rodrigo, mas tem mais outra que chegou aqui, do Yuri Lima, que ele pergunta que no Brasil, 40% dos jovens com ensino superior atuam em ocupações que não exigem esse grau de escolaridade, assim, né? E como é que a empregabilidade é tratada nas universidades onde vocês atuam? O Yuri estuda transformações no mundo do trabalho, é o laboratório do futuro, né? O mundo do trabalho, então ele tem estudado aí as transformações e a inserção depois, talvez vocês consigam ajudar a gente a responder. Mas, bom, vamos seguir a ordem, se você conseguir registrar as perguntas do Rodrigo, depois se der.
Yeah, so I don't think Pat understands the translation, so I'll just translate quickly, Pat. I think the question we got is about, you know, the need for higher education for the majority of the jobs that are available. Is there a need, I guess, is the question, given one study that shows in Brazil, at least, that the majority of the employed, you know, labor force is not doing anything that needs a higher education degree. I'm not, I'll just quickly say my philosophy, not my knowledge in terms of study. I think that is a problem, right? I mean, the economy in the US is certainly driven by having, I mean, the folks with degrees certainly have a better life and more flexibility in the changing world that we live in. And the jobs that, and I think Pat mentioned this at some point about optimization, right? The more, I mean, Brazil is not automated, and you know, we are still in we can look at the US and predict the future that's going to happen in Brazil to some extent, that, you know, it's unlikely that all the little things that people can do without a degree will survive automation. So, you know, having incentives to get some form of degree, it doesn't have to be the 4-year version. So the community college is a 2-year professionalization type with minimum amount of, you know, skills that you develop. I think that's crucial for a future in which the jobs that the majority is working on now might disappear overnight, depending on the economy. And I think that flexibility is crucial. And I don't think that we should relax and say, oh, people don't need degrees, because the world is changing so fast that I worry about a shock and a lot of unemployment. But, you know, Pat, you might know more about this.
Yes, studies that I have seen show that kind of across the board, having any post-high school training will impact your salary, even if it's a 2 or 3 month certificate. Even if you go to what they call one of the garage universities in Mexico. So it's not just getting even like a two-year community college degree. Anything past high school will increase your opportunities and your income. And there are certain points at which there are probably larger jumps in those opportunities, but anything. That I know that there are, I have many friends who work in the technical universities in Brazil of various types. I don't think they fully realize how important they can be in terms of lifting up people, beginning to lift up out of poverty, young workers.
Acho que como a gente está chegando no fim, vou pedir a Angela para fazer as considerações finais.
Okay.
Depois
okay, so I'll close my piece and then Pat could close hers, right? So Pat, be prepared, you're closing next. You started and you close.
Okay.
All right, so I wanted to close by addressing a couple of the open items on the Hosanna and Rodrigo's list. One about Hosanna's, how is the future going to look like given the pandemic? And I think there are pluses and minuses like most shocks. And I do agree that I think people learn to teach more flexibly, which I think is a good thing. But mental health, I think, is a major challenge. And Pat mentioned how the impact on women was especially tough, but I also see the impact on teenagers being incredibly hard, because that's the development age that you kind of learn to socialize and have your own self, and then you're stuck with dad and mom at home or just mom, because that's what Pat was saying, the majority ends up with the mom. So I think the mental health is something that we'll need to really work hard to bring. So at the University of Chicago, for example, we made more accessible mental health in 2 dimensions than we had before. So anybody can have a help of a psychologist when they need it. So, much easier than we used to in the past, because I think the need is huge. Obviously, we don't have enough psychologists to handle the load, but it's something very big. And so that's one of the negative on the impact. And then I wanted just to close by addressing a piece that Rodrigo brought, which was about interdisciplinarity and the digital humanities that I mentioned. I think that knowledge is, hard to predict where the next revolution will be. But, my belief is that boundaries between knowledge is where things grow. So interdisciplinarity is really crucial. So I think that, for the humanists facing the digital revolution and adopting as much as it matters to that subfield is a good thing for creating new things, but one needs to be able to, feel comfortable in that space. But I think that's happening. I see a lot of that happening around me, although, some classical guitar musicians should stay classical guitar musicians, like my husband, and not start playing classical guitar on the computer. That's not going to sound as beautiful, but at least not for now, maybe in the future. So, but I do believe sincerely that, these, the exchange between fields is always very helpful. I learned a lot from Pat today. And, I think, I can tell you more about astronomy at a different place, because this wasn't the theme for today. And hopefully you learn something about astrophysics too. And that also makes us think differently about whatever we were thinking about, even if it's not completely linear, the impact of that over our own subfield. I think the overlaps are always energizing, and you have a fresh look on things that, and even solve problems that were there to begin with. So I think interdisciplinarity is really a wonderful place to be every time we can. But breaking those, silos is always a challenge, because folks get comfortable in them. So that would be my final word. Just let's break some more silos and create new things. Pat, to you. So
I started off talking about black swan events and disrupting the status quo. We have an opportunity to re-envision our society in any number of ways, whether it's diversity or education or whatever. There's so many issues that we can tackle anew. So I would say, this may be something that can be beneficial in many ways. I think we have to keep responding. I think we've just seen the first wave. The next wave may not be COVID. It may be the monkeypox, for example, which is hitting the LGBTQ community very, very hard. But there will be other viruses and other crises, and we need to be vigilant in looking at data that indicates that there may be an issue. We need some kind of monitoring. At the University of Texas, we received some public funding in order to have this huge mathematics, statistics, Dell Medical group looking at the data for the university as well as for Texas in general. And even if it's on a very small scale, even if you're just looking at your university or the small town that you are in, pay attention to the data as much as you can, because this is the start. There will be many new normals, not just one new normal. Brian Alexander talks about toggling back and forth and how we have toggle terms. If our COVID rate among the students gets too high, we toggle online, then we toggle offline. So there will be a lot of toggle terms. There will be a lot of changes, and each one may be different, and it may be for a different reason. Some of it may not even be medical. I agree that mental health is really, really important, and it's kind of left out in this whole process. We need to address that. It seems like every day, every time I go online, there's another shooting or another act of violence. And we have to be a lot smarter about how we predict that and how we prepare, and particularly how we're going to protect younger people, those under the age of 18. It's just having just come out off of the Uvalde tragedy in Texas. Boy, there were some really stupid people who just, everyone in the whole school knew that you couldn't lock one of the doors. And they could have just waltzed right in and taken out the shooter. But they were paralyzed by what they perceived as the rules. They were not very well prepared. A lot of this is common sense. It's not rocket science. It's common sense. So there's a lot of work we have to do. And we do have to work a lot with our teams because we can learn from them about the issues that we've gone through in the last 2 years so that we can make the future better. Yes, this is very, very painful, but there can be some good changes that come out of this.
Eu queria agradecer enormemente em meu nome, e acho que eu não desliguei, e no nome dos meus colegas, né, membros da cátedra. Deixa eu desativar aqui. Em nome dos meus colegas da cátedra, a presença de vocês, muito obrigada. Eu sei que a agenda é difícil, né? Foi difícil a gente arranjar um buraquinho comum aí nessas agendas. Vocês trouxeram várias coisas para a gente refletir, que são super importantes, né? Acho que o desafio para pensar, né, como é que os rumos para a gente colocar a universidade, a educação superior, né, nos trilhos aí do futuro já eram enormes antes da pandemia, né? E se ficaram maiores ainda, né? Assim, vocês trouxeram a questão da mulher, que o impacto foi maior, a saúde mental, o impacto sobre os jovens, né? Isso tornou os desafios que a gente já tinha ainda maiores, né? Então a gente vai precisar, né, entender e avançar aí nessa discussão. Eu agradeço bastante, em nome de todos os meus colegas, em meu nome, muito obrigada pela nossa mesa, pela discussão. Eu agradeço bastante. Acho que a gente encerra por aqui e a gente se mantém em contato aí, tá bom? Não sei se Rosana e Rodrigo falam alguma coisa ou a gente pode encerrar.
Não, só agradecer imensamente pelas apresentações e pelo excelente debate, e temos muito a conversar. Vamos seguir conversando, porque são experiências bastante distintas dos Estados Unidos e do Brasil, e essa abordagem comparativa é muito importante para todos nós.
Sim, só agradecer também a oportunidade de continuar o debate. Boa tarde.
Rosana? Acho que ela tentou falar. Bom, acho que a gente encerra, então. Obrigada, pessoal. Acho que pode... Ah, tchau, tchau. Encerrar a transmissão, Yuri.